Beijing's cover-up of the coronavirus outbreak, its heavy-handed tactics in Hong Kong, and what some are calling a genocide of the Uyghurs, have forced many people to awaken to the chilling realities of the Chinese Communist Party. But practitioners of Falun Gong have faced this every day since July 20th of 1999, when the Chinese regime banned Falun Gong and sought to eradicate the popular spiritual practice.
Tens of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners from all over the country was sent to that sports stadium by bus and forced by the armed police to line up while the loudspeaker at the sports stadium repeat the news of the full ban of Falun Gong in a loop.
For the past 21 years, practitioners have been demonized, tortured, killed for their beliefs, and even had their organs forcibly extracted.
Completely transform who they are into obedient followers of the communist state, or they're going to die in the process.
In this episode, we sit down with Crystal Chen, a Falun Gong practitioner and torture survivor, and Levi Browde, the executive director of the Falun Dafa Information Center. Their stories and insights offer a window into the threat China's ruling regime poses, not just to Hong Kongers and the Chinese people, but also to the rest of the world.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. So Crystal, tell me about your life before July 20th of 1999.
Before 1999, my life was very good. So I work as an assistant of the executive in the largest textile import and export corporation in Guangzhou. And I started to learn Falun Dafa with my mom in 1997. Although at that time, my mom, suffered a very serious stroke and paralyzed, and also breast cancer. But miraculously, and she recovered after just a few months of taking up the Falun Gong practice. So we practiced Dafa and studied the Fa, and at that time the Falun Gong was very popular in the city. Besides all the meditation sites in the park, and there are also some people in my workplace also practice Falun Gong. Even during the lunch break, we'll have a Falun Gong meditation section at the workplace.
So in your city at the time, how did people practice?
Every morning they went to the park, and even in the evening after dinner, and we also will have a Falun Gong free, like a teaching instruction section in almost all the parks. So life is very good at that time. So just imagine people follow the principle of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, and do peaceful exercise in the park and teaching other people. And some people even told us that they just walking on the street, and they hear very beautiful songs, and they follow the songs and then find the practice site. Oh, that is Falun Gong.
Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based spiritual practice that's centered on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Falun Gong was first introduced in 1992, and by 1999, there were 100 million people practicing. That's a lot of people, even in a country as populous as China. That's 1 out of every 13 people. And it was being practiced in every province, from people all walks of life, high-ranking government officials, homemakers, farmers, you name it.
So your mother discovered this practice. She had some amazing healing effects from doing it. Is that's how you got interested?
So my mom used to be a soprano, a singer. So suddenly that her life is bringing to a star on the stage to nothing. She couldn't even move her body. So it's very sad. But I remember while she was in the hospital, in the cancer hospital, and one day she decided to go out to do some Qigong. At that time, I know nothing about Qigong because I was born and raised in communist China. I was brainwashed that all the qigong or religious superstitious. It's not good. So I doubt about it. But my mom was very, very determined, and she said that someone just sent her a book of Zhuan Falun, which is the main book of Falun Gong, and she thought that it's very good, and she decided to go out for a try. And she told me that you didn't know how miserable I was in the hospital, and knowing that it might not be cured. So I was very skeptical, but I love my mom. I decided to go with her and to escort her, accompany her to see whether this Falun Gong will work for her. Sure enough, it was very good. So my mom recovered miraculously, after just a few months taking up this practice. And I was started to think, what is this? This is so new to me. And I started to also read the book.
So let's move to July 20th now of 1999. So you've been practicing for a few years. And what were you doing around that time?
I remember on July 19, 1999, I learned that several Falun Gong local practitioners were being, harassed by the government and also arrested. So I decided to join a group of Falun Gong practitioners to appeal at the city and the provincial petition bureau for their release. But we were told that the Falun Gong issue has to be handled by the central government. That is what we were told. So we decided to go to Beijing, the central government, to appeal. And by chance that we got the train ticket for the next day. So I bought it on the train on July 20, and then it takes us 2 days to arrive in Beijing on the July 22nd. We didn't hear anything about the full ban of Falun Gong because we were in transit. By the time that we went to appeal at the Central Petition Bureau, that was July 23rd. So we didn't really know where exactly the Petition Bureau was, but we know that it's around the Tiananmen Square area. So when we passed by Tiananmen Square, that we saw a group of must be Falun Gong practitioner was meditating in the square. And we wanted to join that group of practitioners. And suddenly, all the plainclothes and police van just rushing and to that group, including me. And I was then arrested and sent to a Feng Tai sports stadium in a Beijing suburb. That was a dramatic scene. I never experienced anything like that. Tens of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners from all over the country was sent to that sports stadium by bus. And we were just, forced by the armed police to line up, and you are not allowed to make any noise, while the loudspeaker at the sports stadium repeats the news of the full ban of Falun Gong in a loop. I just felt like I was in a gruesome movie.
It's an incredible story. I mean, and from what I know, this was, I'm not sure if that counts exactly as an arrest, but I know you actually were arrested 6 times over the coming years.
Yes, and that was the first time is my first experience being arrested just for attempted to appeal for the stop of the persecution of Falun Gong and expressing how benefit the Falun Gong due to me, myself, and my mom.
I remember that back in the 2000, I believe Jiang Zemin, the dictator at the time, said we're going to eradicate this group, that word, eradicate. Now, what did that actually mean? It wasn't like we're going to kill all these people, right, necessarily. But what did that mean, and what was the, how did this eradication proceed, and is it still happening now?
That's a very good question, and it goes to the heart of what's behind this campaign. What does it really consist of? I mean, I've seen one scholar call it a cold genocide. And really what it means is we're going to take these 100 million people, and instead of, like what they do to Jews in World War II, just putting them in gas chambers and killing them physically, we're going to transform their hearts and minds, usually through significant torture and high-powered brainwashing techniques. But the goal is to actually change what that person thinks, actually change who they are, from someone who is striving to align themselves with truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, to someone who's completely obedient to the state. I think one of the most compelling stories about this, individual stories, was actually the Washington Post article. You know, they had done this story back, I think, in 2001, 2002, where they found someone who had gone through this process. So this Falun Gong practitioner was taken into custody. Not only was he tortured and underwent these horrific sort of psychological techniques, but once they had broken him, that wasn't good enough. He now had to go to study sessions and start to show that he's taking the communist ideology into his heart. That wasn't good enough. He now had to stand up in front of a camera and they film him while he professes his allegiance to the party and how great the party was. And he came out of this process, and one of the things that struck me at the end is he sort of said, what I've learned is we, human beings, he's talking about, are the worst animals on earth. And his case was, I think, a very vivid example of what Jiang Zemin meant by eradicate. He is going to completely transform who they are into obedient followers of the communist state, or they're going to die in the process.
I was sentenced to forced labor camp without trial, and I was sent to detention center, brainwashing center, all sorts of, property that the Chinese Communist regime that persecuted Dafa practitioner. And also I experienced different type of torture, of course, not only physical, also mental. So I remember my first experience being physically tortured was in a detention center in my city, Guangzhou City, the Tianhe Detention Center. I was forced to have a high-density salt torture, which seems very weird, right? But that torture actually is that I was forced to have this like a high-density water, high-density salt by, 5 big, large male detainees putting me down on the floor, and they cut this bottle, water bottle in half as a funnel, and they cover my eyes with a very dirty towels used to wipe the floor. And then they shove this 1 pound bag of the salt with just a little bit water in it, and shove this opening of the bottle and trying to pry my mouth open. And then I feel like the salt is all over my nose, my eyes, and I feel really, really hot pain. It's very painful. And at the same time that they use a stick to scratch my feet so that I will gasp. And so all this salt will put it into my throat, my stomach. So it's really, really painful. So I couldn't breathe. I struggle to fight against this pain, but at the same time that I feel that I'm going to die.
So they're basically force feeding you salt water, the really
Salt,
super high
density salt. The result, it was very painful. I couldn't eat after this torture. I couldn't eat nor excrete. And if I vomit blood and salt for the next few days. So it's very dangerous. It could kill people. And that's why that when we suffer this, we already, protest to the prison guard and said that if you continue doing this, you're gonna kill people. They stop. It's just because I remember when the moment that I thought that I was going to die, I pray to, for the divine help for me to endure. But at the same time, I said to myself that I will never give up. I will never give up. But I'm praying for the divine help for me to endure. Almost immediate at that moment, the chief guard ordered to stop. It is amazing. And also at the same time, one of the 5 big guys holding me down fell over. And because of that, they stopped.
Why is it so important for you to keep practicing?
As I mentioned that before I practiced Dava, I was completely, an atheism. I didn't believe there is a higher being existing, and I didn't even know that there is a way for a human being to, become awakened through spiritual discipline. But ever since I practiced Falun Gong, I feel like I got what I want. Because even though that before practice, I led a pretty good life, well-educated, good family, promising career in a big company. But I always ask myself a question that where am I from? What am I doing in my life? Is that all my life is all about? Just, get educated, marry, good family, and have a good work. That's it. And where are we going if I die? This is the question that deep in my heart. But Falun Gong definitely give me the answer, and that is what I am seeking for in my life.
What people typically associate with Falun Gong is the organ harvesting issue. There was a China tribunal this year, but that followed on all sorts of, attempts to look at this issue, gather evidence, and so forth, again, over more than a decade. So people hear about this organ harvesting issue. Can you briefly tell me about the connection to Falun Gong?
Sure. Organ harvesting, we became aware of it. It came on our radar mid-2000s. And just so everyone knows, the practice of forced organ harvesting is essentially taking prisoners of conscience, killing them, extracting their organs, and using that in a transplantation operation, and it was fueling a billion-dollar business in China. So it first came on the radar for us when a doctor and a former wife of a doctor came to us and said, look, this is happening. And very quickly we started looking into that and found some very disturbing evidence. In particular, there's some phone calls that undercover investigators did where they actually called these different hospitals, and we have recorded doctors admitting, yes, you can get organs in just a few days' time or a week, and yes, they're coming from Falun Gong people. And after that, a number of journalists and some human rights lawyers logged into the story and started doing more investigation and realized that in China, in these various hospitals, you can get organs in a matter of days or weeks, where in most countries, it's months or years. Because if you think about it, you have to wait till somebody just happens to die who just happens to be a match with you as an organ. So, but in China, they were saying days and weeks for wait times. That could only happen if there's an already ready, if there's a pool of people that they've already tested and they can kill to do organ transplantation. So this is obviously a horrific human rights abuse, and we noticed also that the correlation between the number of transplants was very low in China, and it took off right at the time that hundreds and thousands of Falun Gong practitioners were being brought and held in labor camps and other detention facilities. So the correlation was direct.
I remember when I was in forced labor camp, I was systematically, tortured, but at the same time, and only Falun Gong practitioner in the labor camp or in detention center get physical tested and physical exam. That didn't make any sense to me at that moment, because that cannot be motivated by, the concern over the health of Falun Gong practitioner, because we are systematically tortured. And I personally get tested several times, including 2 times of blood test. So later on, when I was released and I heard about the organ harvesting, that is horrible. I couldn't even imagine that will happen. But that, answer the question that why we will get tested and examined in the labor camp, in the detention center. They targeted innocent and healthy Falun Gong practitioners.
It's unbelievable. I think David Matas, one of the early investigators who was actually, I guess you call him a Nazi hunter,
yes.
He was hunting down the last Nazi war criminals in Canada. He called it an evil yet to be seen on this planet, I believe. Were the words. I actually did a little bit of the early reporting on this back in the day as well. So it's still happening?
Very much so. In fact, the China tribunal that you had mentioned, they came out with their final judgment just a few months ago. And not only did they conclude, yes, this is happening on a significant scale, and it's ongoing today. And I think what's interesting is that, if you noticed in the news a couple months ago in Wuhan, they made a lot of fanfare about a double lung transplant. And what's very peculiar about that is it showed all the same red flags that we've had with forced organ harvesting all along. Where did they get these lungs so quickly and get them to Wuhan? The whole thing it's very clear, both from the evidence and the tribunal, that this is something that's still going on today.
That's an interesting case, because obviously that was some kind of a propaganda push by the regime. These lung transplants, look what we can do, this kind of thing. And this propaganda, of course, fits into this whole Falun Gong story extensively. Before I go there, you know, one of the things that I remember is the reason why people would call and ask if it's Falun Gong, like why would someone do that, is because Falun Gong were known to be healthy. And I think this is again, a kind of really perverse, twisted aspect of the organ harvesting story.
That is the sad irony, or one of the tragic parts of this, is that Falun Gong brought tremendous health benefits to the people of China, and then the CCP seized on that and said, we're going to take these people, and because they're so healthy, we're going to make them the primary victim group, the primary source of organs, keep them in detention, and kill them every time we want to do an organ transplant operation.
With a marginalized group, there's a kind of ease of using people in this sort of a dictatorship this way that I think maybe even David Matus was also the one who identified this kind of issue. Can you speak to that a bit?
I think that's a great point, because it touched on two things, I think, is how did Falun Gong become a marginalized group? Because again, if you go back to the 1990s, Falun Gong was everywhere. It's in every park. It's like, and it was a Chinese thing. It wasn't, you know, after decades of living under communist rule, along comes Falun Gong that's sort of heartland China. I mean, it's sort of like apple pie, church on Sunday, and baseball all wrapped into one, you know, the analogy to America. It was very Chinese, and it was very something that people were proud about. So how do you take an enormous population within China that is very much part of the mainstream and make them marginalized? That was the first question, and that has been, over the course of several years, a targeted and very horrific campaign of propaganda to sort of turn people's minds from admiring Falun Gong to despising it. And once you have people thinking that way, this sort of natural distance now becomes much more easy for an institution like the medical institution to take over and do horrific things to these people. And quite honestly, it's a pattern we've seen in sort of genocidal activity throughout human history. That is a vital component, is to marginalize and dehumanize. And once that can be achieved, the rank and file and various institutions can be unleashed to do horrible things. And that's really what we've seen with organ harvesting.
How is it that this propaganda worked? You know, I just watched this film, Ask No Questions, you know, and you actually appeared in it. I wasn't expecting that. It's just something that's come out recently. I tend to watch the films that have to do with China human rights issues. And it talks about the self-immolation, right? The self-immolation event, which is, I think, a central piece of propaganda in all of this. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. I mean, that was the turning point, because, you know, back in 1999, the head of the Communist Party at that time, Jiang Zemin, was really the one who wanted to persecute Falun Gong. No one else did, including other members of the Politburo, you know, the highest body of governance in the country. And really, I mean, he looked at Falun Gong, and for three reasons he wanted to do this. One, because it was so popular. 100 million people is a lot of people outside of direct CCP control. Two was ideology. I mean, the Communist Party is sort of an atheist organization, quite literally, and along comes a faith-based group that's very rooted in traditional Chinese culture. So there was an ideology threat there to Jiang Zemin, but I think the real reason, the dominant reason, and perhaps the most tragic part of this, was that Jiang Zemin was the first Chinese Communist Party leader who hadn't really participated in the revolution and didn't have any credibility, even among his peers. He was desperate to build up his legacy. And right as he's trying to do that, along comes Falun Gong. Takes the country by storm. Everybody's talking about it, how great it is, and essentially steals his thunder. So he's the one who said, we have to stamp this out. We have to take Falun Gong out. There was a bit of a power struggle in the summer of 1999, but he prevailed. And once that started, the persecution was launched. However, as we've been discussing, you know, this is, again, Falun Gong is not, to Chinese people, It's not foreign. They know this. They know people, but they're people in their family. So how do you get people to turn around? A lot of provinces, a lot of areas weren't taking part in this persecution initially, especially further out in the provinces. And Jiang Zemin actually had to take a tour around the country, especially the southern part of the country, to drum up support and to threaten people and coerce them to do this persecution. And that was having some effect. But it wasn't until the self-immolation that things really turned around. So in January of 2001, 5 people set themselves on fire, allegedly, in Tiananmen Square. The police, for some crazy reason, were there to film it. They were taking pictures. They got the whole thing on camera. And that was used in a propaganda blitz to show the Chinese people just how, quote unquote, evil Falun Gong was. Look, people are burning themselves. Isn't this terrible? And the images were so horrific, the narrative so sort of twisted, that really turned the tide inside China in terms of people thinking, oh, Falun Gong is great. It's come from, you know, it's the best of our Chinese culture, to, oh, this is bad. Or at least if they weren't even convinced with the propaganda, which was running 24/7. I mean, it was everywhere. They were at least so scared of the issue, they just didn't want to deal with it. So the self-immolation was the turning point to get the rank and file around the country to really take persecuting Falun Gong seriously.
You know, in the film, they interview one of the CNN correspondents who was actually happened to be on the scene, and it's just there's all sorts of these kind of bizarre inconsistencies. The media say that the CNN was somehow provided the footage. They say, no, there's no way. We actually had to hide it, pretend it didn't exist. Anyway, the story kind of goes on, and there's, you know, a lot of evidence that this was actually manufactured. Even though the actual truth of it probably will never be known because it was all controlled by the regime.
That's right. And I mean, the one reporter that was brave enough to look into this, Philip Pan with the Washington Post, he went to the hometown of 2 of the alleged self-immolators and found that no one had ever seen these 2 people practice. And there was all kinds of anomalies in terms of what they were saying on the square, how they were sitting. None of it looked like Falun Gong. The police were behaving in a very strange manner, waiting until they said stuff so that they could get it on camera and use it for propaganda purposes before they put the blanket on them or dealt with them, which is completely different from how they deal with Falun Gong people on Tiananmen Square. If you see any of the footage, the minute someone steps on the square and says something positive about Falun Gong, they're racing out, they tackle them, they take them to the ground, they get them to the van, trying to make sure they don't say anything. This was the exact opposite. Several organizations have looked at this and said this was clearly staged. And a lot of these anomalies make that very clear, that all the sort of the movie techniques they used, but also the fact that these reports came out so quick in a matter of hours. In some cases, I think some of the reports came out before the victims, so-called victims, were even brought to the hospital. I mean, some of this stuff was very quick, and it was a propaganda blitz. I mean, literally 24/7, it was running for quite some time. So it is well understood that this was staged, but the damage was still done because inside China, there is only one media, and that's the state-run media, and it had an effect.
Tell me briefly, you know, what ended up happening to your mother and your family?
I lost my mom because of the persecution of Falun Gong. I was sent to the same detention center and the same labor camp with my mom, but we were separated and never had a chance to see each other for almost 3 years. But later, I was told by some of the fellow practitioners who spent some time with my mom in the prison or in the labor camp, and they told me that my mom also suffered brutal persecution. One of the persecution to my mom is electric baton shocks. And they shocked my mom for almost 2 hours without a break. And also, it shocked all the very sensitive part of her body, like the underarm and the inner side of her thigh, and also the ear, the neck. And my mom was, covered with all this black bruise and burns. You can imagine 2 hours of electric baton shocks. And it can even smell the skin burn of my mom. And then my mom was tortured in the detention center, in the labor camp, and also later to brainwashing center. That is a facility that specializes in persecuting Falun Gong practitioners. Without trial, without any legal protection. It's a black jail. And then after all these years persecution, my mom died in August of 2006 after her release from all the persecution that in custody. The persecution on Falun Gong, to me, that it's not only a persecution on Falun Gong group itself. It is a persecution to the humanity and the spirituality in a whole. People think that, Falun Gong practitioners are being persecuted, but they didn't know that at the same time, our families and our co-workers, they all threaten. For example, my ex-husband was forced by the 610 office to divorce me when I was in jail. And my father, they forced my father to say that, well, if you don't follow what the Communist Party asks you to do, to denounce Falun Gong, we're gonna cut our biological relationship. That sounds ridiculous, right? But that is what the communist regime forced their innocent people to do, to put pressures on your family, to create all this fear, because people don't want to lose their existing benefit, their comfort needs, their life, their job, their freedom, even their life. The communists just create fear to everyone related. For example, they will force the inmate to torture us. And if they follow what they said, and they will get released quickly, earlier, that's a benefit. If the police will torture us and also force us to transform and denounce Falun Gong, they get promoted. They get extra bonus for it. It's all about that.
Let's talk about something that's very fresh in the news right now, and it frankly has a lot of us really worried, and a lot of good friends of mine very worried, which is this new Hong Kong national security law. What are the implications for Falun Gong?
The implication is actually worse than mainland China in terms of what could happen to a Falun Gong practitioner or anybody that crosses this law in Hong Kong. And that's what I think was so shocking about this. And I'll give you a very specific example. In mainland China, what you tend to see is when they sentence a Falun Gong practitioner to prison, it may be 3 years, 5 years, it goes all the way up to like 18 years. On the Hong Kong law, minimum 10 years, it could be a life sentence. So that's one example of how they've actually outdone themselves, where the implication for people inside Hong Kong could be worse. There's also this draconian aspect of this law where, for very vaguely worded reasons, authorities in Beijing could decide, we're going to take whoever it is that was just arrested in Hong Kong, we're going to bring them to mainland China, we're going to do the trial there, where obviously they have total control over the entire legal system, prosecution, judges, and so forth. So it has made Hong Kong as bad, or not, if not worse, than mainland China. One other thing that's particularly troubling about the law is there are aspects of it that allow Chinese agents to come in and basically operate in the offices of Hong Kong. And so the 610 office, which is sort of the Gestapo, China's Gestapo for persecuting Falun Gong, that's its sole mission, now has the legal framework to come in and operate in Hong Kong. And so very much a concern for anybody who practices or speaks out or advocates in any way for Falun Gong in Hong Kong.
Well, so this is actually fascinating, I think, for our viewers, and just the concept that there is a organization like a Gestapo that you described that's solely dedicated to the destruction of Falun Gong that's been operating for how long?
21 years.
And so tell me about this organization. What kind of powers does it have? What does it actually do?
Sure. So the organization is called the 610 Office, and it was formed in June of 1999, which is before they announced the persecution. So they're already preparing this. It's an extra-legal agency that reports directly to the Politburo, which means it has jurisdiction over the whole country, over any government agency, over any group of police. And their sole mission, they were created solely to implement Jiang Zemin's persecution campaign against Falun Gong, which is kind of how they've got the name China's Gestapo. That's all that they do. And they can override decisions at the provincial level, the city level, the local level, when they want to go after Falun Gong. And they've been operating for 21 years. Now, as the CCP has done frequently in other regards, a few years ago there was an announcement that, oh, you know what, we're going to dissolve the 610 office. We're no longer going to have that. But after that, even as early as most recently as this year, we've got documents coming out of China and other evidence to indicate that indeed this agency is still operational and is still doing the core function of persecuting Falun Gong. So that's what China's Gestapo is all about.
So basically these guys can come in and commandeer any security resources.
That's correct. And again, they report to the Politburo. And so they're really a Communist Party entity above the government.
So Levi, we've been becoming aware, I guess, as the free world, especially over the last few years, of how much influence and power the Chinese Communist Party yields over American, international, all sorts of institutions. There's been, we now have the FARA reports, $19 million was spent just on China Daily inserts in major American media by the Chinese Communist Party. How is the Chinese Communist Party influencing the media? Has it influenced the reporting on Falun Gong or the lack of reporting on Falun Gong?
I think you have to conclude that it has. And I say that for a few reasons. First of all, if you just look at across industries, I mean, look what happened with the NBA, right? I mean, normally you have players and coaches who are very politically vocal, which is great, more power to them. But along comes one person who says something about Hong Kong, and suddenly the CCP swoops in and everybody goes quiet. No one wants to answer questions, and when they do, they obviously haven't done their homework. You see this in Hollywood, you certainly see it in government. Inevitably, you're going to see it in media. Our media companies are companies. They're for-profit companies. Many of them have enormous business interests in China. And that aside, we've had several reporters that are very candid with us that tell us that there's only so far they can go in terms of exposing the CCP because they might be kicked out of China or they might lose these business interests. So it is invariably so that media coverage of Falun Gong is being influenced by the CCP, just like the CCP is influencing all these other sectors. I think there's another interesting aspect to this, and that is, how did we get to this place? How did the CCP become such an entity that would influence in this regard? The persecution of Falun Gong played a role in that. So again, going back to 1999, you've got 100 million people all around the country from every sort of walk of life. How are you going to persecute those people? You have to weaponize every institution of society in order to get that done. And what does that mean? Well, one of the prominent features of this we saw over the years is that people who would persecute Falun Gong, who would go along with this, rise through the ranks. Those who would not would be demoted or often sometimes fired. I mean, literally, if you're a leader in a business, if you're the one who's going to say, okay, I've identified 3 Falun Gong people in my work unit, get them off to a labor camp, you're going to go up because of that. We saw this in every industry across China. So what does that do for the culture of the business, for the society at large? It essentially criminalizes all these institutions. Jeffrey Nice, actually, who was the lead prosecutor in the China tribunal that you referenced, said as much in the final judgment. He investigated the forced organ harvesting and came to the conclusion that in the CCP we're dealing with a criminal state. And it really is true. And the implementation of the Falun Gong persecution is a large part of creating that. And now we in the international community have to now deal with that, because these institutions that have been weaponized, that have been imbued with the mechanisms of persecution, of having leadership that would do that, having propaganda policies around what they do, is now touching our government, our businesses, our media. And we're seeing the effects of that. If you look at the NBA, if you look at some of the things that the Chinese regime is doing on calling our members of Congress and asking them to persecute Falun Gong or do this or do that, the type of influence we're seeing in every sector where we interact with the CCP has that character and has that risk to us.
So Levi, this brings to mind another case, actually very, very recently, middle of 2020, a very affluent woman sentenced to 8 years, as I understand it, purely for practicing Falun Gong.
That's right. Yeah. What's interesting about her case is she's a Canadian citizen. So let's take a look at what happened to her. Years ago, she's the VP of a multi-billion-dollar biochemical company in China. And many years ago, several years ago, she was in China. She was pulled out of her apartment. She was arrested just because she's a Falun Gong practitioner. And for years, the Canadian government has been voicing their concern. The community, obviously the human rights community, has been protesting her being detained. And she's been through just some horrific things. Forced, because of the tense situation, her husband was forced to divorce her. There have been 11 lawyers who've tried to take on their cases and have not take on her case and have not been allowed to. So she's been sort of persecuted while in prison for years. And then at the end of June of this year, suddenly the CCP announces, oh, we're imprisoning her for 8 years. Again, simply because she's a Falun Gong practitioner, and despite all the protests of the Canadian government and the international community.
Levi, looking at this case, this woman has been in jail for a number of years. Now she's suddenly sentenced to 8 more after years of persecution already. Canadian government helpless to help their own citizen in this situation. Makes me think of this, let's call it, wild lack of transparency for what happens in China. And this actually, has been highlighted recently by the coronavirus situation, the UN, the coronavirus situation, the Chinese influence on the WHO, all these things. And it reminds me actually of something that David Matas has written about pretty recently, which is that had we, as the free world, I suppose, demanded more transparency in the realm of organ transplants and other realms of China, maybe this would have never happened, this whole coronavirus pandemic.
I think it's an excellent point, and it's a tragic reminder about how important it is to keep your eye on egregious human rights abuses. Because in the case, I think the point he was making is that, if we had taken this seriously, we would have made sure that not only were they stopping organ harvesting, but we could see it, right? We had enough transparency into China that we could see that, and had that transparency been in place, the pandemic would have never happened. Is he right? I think what's interesting here is Taiwan, because Taiwan is an example, I think, that he is right. So let's take a look at Taiwan. Back in December 31st, right, their doctors were watching the chatter for the Wuhan doctors, and they knew right away we had a deadly virus on our hands and it was human transmittable. And then, so that's the transparency part. They were also the biggest victims, one of the biggest victims outside of China because of SARS. They were hit very, very hard. And so they also had an awareness that whatever the CCP says about this virus, do not listen to. Combined with that transparency and the knowledge to not listen to the talking points of the CCP, they got to work. And they were immediately, back in December 31st, more than a month before the rest of the world was doing this, they're already monitoring traffic coming in for Wuhan and the rest of China. They've never had to lock down. This entire time, they've had only 7 deaths. In the United States, we have what, 130,000? Brazil has 60,000. 7. You can safely say Taiwan never had the pandemic. Yes, they take precautionary measures, they wear face masks, but they've never had to take any of the lockdown measures we've had, and they've had only 7 deaths. And they did that because they had transparency into exactly what was happening with China, and they had enough awareness to know not to believe the CCP or anybody speaking for them, and they should act in their own best interest according to their own medical personnel. I think Taiwan proves that David Mattis is right.
So Levi, any final words before we finish up?
Well, a couple things I'd like to say is, one is to let people know that this is still going on. I mean, again, day after day we get cases from China, and we know of, for example, at the end of June, there was a group of 36 people that were rounded up in the Beijing area because they're Falun Gong practitioners. One of them was a 68-year-old woman. Just a few hours later, she dies in police custody. Back in April 19th, I remember this case where a woman who was not a Falun Gong practitioner, her husband was a practitioner, but she was defending him. The police picked her up. She was abused in custody, and she died. So this is something that's very much continuing and going on even to this very day. And it remains tragic, even after 21 years. The other thing I would say is that it's important to stay informed about this kind of thing. Our organization, the Falun Dafa Information Center, can be found online at faluninfo.net, faluninfo.net. And there's a wealth of information there about not only what's happening in China, but what people are doing here in the United States and other countries. Our Congress is taking action. There's another resolution actually on the Senate side that is condemning the persecution, particularly forced organ harvesting. These things matter. They make a difference. So if you want to help, go to the website, find out what's going on, give your congressman or your senator a call in this case, and let them know this matters to you.
So Crystal, what would you say to all the Hong Kongers that are hoping to preserve freedom in Hong Kong?
I would say that don't give up. Based on my personal experience, a lot of people right now that they kind of, take a peek at the Hong Kong situation. That's kind of like a window to showcase the nature, the evil nature of the CCP. And that's why people think that there is no hope for people to, find the gains, because they have the whole, apparatus, military, police, even, arms. They have everything. We're just an innocent citizens without arms. The only thing that Hong Kong people have is an umbrella to find the gains. But I would say that there is hope. Some people right now say that Falun Gong practitioner is the only one group survive the persecution of the CCP for the longest time, like more than 20 years. For example, like the Tiananmen massacre and all those political campaigns, even the 10 years of Cultural Revolution, they didn't last that long. But the Falun Gong practitioner, they are so persistent, and then they survive for more than 20 years, even though the persecution is still, existing and still going on right now at this moment, never stop. I think it's because Falun Gong, actually it's a true spirituality. It's not a movement to me. It's a spirituality. Like I said, that I have been through all this persecution and physical tortures. I don't think it's because of how strong I am. I'm just an ordinary petite-sized lady. But when I was in a life and death danger, I will reach out to the divine help. I don't think that a human being can defeat the evil force. I can only ask for help from the divine beings to give me strength to endure and to break through. That's my experience.
Crystal Chen, such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me, Jan.